What's up, everyone, and welcome to the Long Game Podcast hosted by Thomas Kopelman and Jacob Turner. In each episode, you'll hear us break down financial topics that are relevant to you and your situation. Our goal is to help bring credible financial information to you in short, bite-sized episodes.
All opinions expressed on this show are for educational, informational, and entertainment purposes only. Nothing on the Long Game Podcast should be considered advice. Always consult with your team of professionals before making any decisions regarding your finances.
Right. What is up, and welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Long Game Podcast. You're here with myself, Thomas Kopelman, and my co-host, Jacob Turner, as well as Kurtis Hanni. He's basically an outsourced CFO for small business owners. And so we really brought him on today to talk about not only like this problem that we see among business owners of, they start out, they're kind of winging it. They're just trying to have a successful business. They start to reach this level of success. They're growing their revenue, they're growing their profits, and all of a sudden their finances are kind of really controlling their life, right? They've never been taught how to be a CFO. They never thought they were going to have to be a CFO, but all of a sudden this business grew to be pretty successful, and a lot of complexities come along with that. And so Kurtis, we're really excited for you to join us. I think we'll kind of end this podcast really talking about you, what you do, and places that people can engage with you, which obviously Twitter is a great place when you have 180,000 followers, which is super impressive. But let's just kind of set the stage here, and let's just talk about, the problem that you see, because obviously my assumption would be you got into this business because you saw how big of a need and a gap there is in this space.
Yeah, for sure. When I got in, I grew up in my career, instead of going the traditional accounting route, I realized I didn't love accounting, but I loved the business side of things. And
Yeah.
so I started out in small businesses. And when you do that, you realize how many people get into business and they literally have never looked at a P&L in their lives. And after a period of time, you start out, you're managing, you're looking at your bank account, you're making things work. But after a period of time, there's a little bit of shame in asking the questions that you need to ask. There's often like a fear of like, I should know this. And so they're afraid to ask. And so I've kind of built my career on trying to be that translator between that business owner that doesn't know anything and me who, has the financial background. And it's fascinating to get in these discussions, and you just really see people light up when they realize that, oh, I'm not alone in this, because I don't remember the exact stat, but it's something like over 50% of business owners feel like they don't understand their financials as well as they should. And so you realize that it's a common thing. So many people feel it, but there's not a whole lot of people, or there's not a lot of easy routes to get that education without trying to go back to school. And so that's my goal in kind of doing this, and where I get energy from, because I think it's fun to see that light bulb come on for them.
Yeah, I mean, it makes a lot of sense, right? I mean, it's honestly probably not worth the average business owner's time, right? Like stay in the lane of revenue producing or management or whatever you're doing there and bring on somebody. Like, I think the problem for most business owners are they're like, we can't afford a CFO that knows what they're doing. But my piece of advice here is you don't really need that. You don't need a full-time CFO. And so there's a lot of people like you. My dad does the same thing, where you can hire somebody who has a lot of experience, and maybe they only have to work 5 to 20 hours a month helping you, depending on the size of your business, which actually allows you to get quite a high quality CFO for a price that's actually most likely less than your typical entry level employee, but they're going to provide significant amount of value.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's been a big education problem, because what the fractional CFO was before COVID happened was, it was a bunch of no shade meant here, but it was a bunch of old guys that didn't want to work full time, that went and worked 20 to 30 hours in someone's office and got some good time off. But really, with the technology and Zoom and all that, it's really changed the way the engagement works. And I think that's good for business owners, because before you'd have to have a really big scale to be able to afford someone, but now it's allowed you at a lot earlier phase to be able to get that advice that you need. And And I don't want to, I don't mean to speak ill of like tax people, but the reality is tax people are focused on tax. They're not often focused on business growth and strategy. And I think um, that's where I can come in. A fractional CFO can come in and really provide that. And I think in some ways, there's a lot of crossover between what I'm doing and what you guys are doing, though you guys are taking a more personal, holistic. But I think our goal as fractional is um, ultimately we want to make sure that the business is getting fed so that they can get fed. And when we can really line out those priorities and strategies, it gets people to a place where they finally feel in control where they've potentially not felt that in before.
It's really interesting to hear you talk about your business, Kurtis, because I think, much like you said, it's very similar to what Thomas and I do, even though from the standpoint of, our goal is to try to educate people around personal finance. Oftentimes somebody might come to us and they might have questions around something that they feel like they should know the answer to. But what I always say is like, there's no stupid questions. Like, this isn't your day to day. You just need to ask the questions. We're here to help guide you along the way. From your perspective, as somebody comes to you, and I think you also made a great point around this idea that CPAs maybe only think about taxes, but all these different components talk to each other, right? Like the business owner, if the business isn't healthy, like what you said, and the business isn't getting fed, they're not able to build their personal net worth. And if they're not thinking about taxes and all these different other things that come into play, what do you tell somebody when they first come to you? What are some of the big key metrics that they should be looking at from a numbers perspective?
Yeah. The first thing is always, I want to understand your goals, because it's through the lens of those goals that we can then evaluate the business and isn't meeting the needs. And the first things that we always go to are, one, we're trying to figure out, are you profitable? And obviously we want to make sure that your cost structures, that your pricing, all of that stuff is good so that you can make sure and kick off a good profit. And then kind of 1A or 1B, whatever you want to call it, is making sure that your cash flow is good. And so we go from looking at pricing and cost structures to now we're saying, are you actually getting the cash in the door? So we look at making sure all your terms with your vendors are right. We look at make sure we understand how you're collecting money from your customers. And when we start to unlock those, it allows really quick wins that a lot of people often miss. And so that's kind of when I look at it and say, let's look at profit, let's look at cash flow. If we can master those two things, everything else over a period of time can kind of wash through the business and we can create something that's sustainable for you as the business owner.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, with all these pass-through entities, which I would assume you do a lot more for, I think a lot of times the average C Corp is probably a little farther along where they probably bring in somebody full time, not all the time, but I would just say in general. But, Jacob alluded to taxes side of things, and I think that's really important. So I'm curious, like how much you play into the personal side a little bit mixed with it. Because I'm thinking about, one of my clients, both husband and wife own a business. Husband's business is pretty big, over 10 million in revenue, scaling super quickly. They think in 4 to 5 years they'll be 100 million. And so what's flowing through to their tax return is, call it 1.5 million plus in taxes per year. Wife's business isn't really quite at that level. But if you were just managing, thinking about this, it'd be hard to realize like, oh yeah, she probably makes $300,000 or $400,000 a year, a good year. But the cash flow side of things is very different because of what this business is doing.
Yeah. We're very clear from the front of we're not a tax advisor. So we try and work with their tax advisors, or we even have recommendations that we can make with tax advisors, like I'm sure you guys can do as well. People that are well versed in it. But the reality is, and yeah, C Corp is a little bit different, but I'm dealing mainly with S Corps and LLCs, and everything is flowing through personally. So you have to understand that full personal scope to be able to understand that person's needs in the business, because it is completely intertwined. And so one of the things that I like to kind of highlight with people is that when we're planning and we're thinking about from an accounting perspective, everything that you have to deal with, you have transaction work, which is what your bookkeeper does. You have strategic work, which is what your CFO is doing. And you have tax work, which is what your tax advisor is doing. My job the way I see it is I want to make sure all three of those are working together, and that I'm focused on strategic, but it's my job as your advisor to help be the translator from the tax side to the strategic side. So that if we're making decisions, we understand both the tax impact and the long-term impact on the business, whether that's cash flow, whether that's profits, whether that's whatever else. And it's kind of my job to because I'm more inside of it and understand it more than you do. Why I never want to keep up on the latest tax rules. I'm going to take what that CPA is telling you is best for your personal tax situation, and I'm going to talk about how we incorporate that into the business and how the different scenarios are going to impact business results down the line.
That makes sense. I think it's just a team game, right? So you're just saying, hey, give me the information, and I know I need to build that into how I'm helping advise you. But still, at the end of the day, I mean, we're doing this a lot on the personal side. We intermix business stuff too, but the goal is to give the information and talk through what this information means. So that way, the CEO can make high level decisions based on that. I mean, I think that makes complete sense. As when you start with a lot of these new people, what are kind of the main areas that they need help on from the beginning? Like, what are the needle movers right away?
Yeah, I'm probably, if you've seen me on Twitter, I'm going to sound like a broken record here, but I've yet to go into a business and see people that are priced appropriately. Everyone's fearful of raising their prices. Everyone's fearful of charging too much. I found businesses where margins on some products are negative, prices on other margins on other products are 90% plus, and it's like there's a lot of, you just go with the default and you don't move on. And so pricing is something that I make sure that we touch on pretty much immediately. And then the second lever we pull, because when you look at the expenses in most businesses, the biggest expense is typically the cost of goods sold. So those are the two really easy levers to pull, because you can typically, again, with the price, you just make a price adjustment or make a contract adjustment. Sometimes it takes time to get through the system, but sometimes it doesn't. And then with your suppliers, you can generally, renegotiate or do something like that. So those are two really big ones. And then this sounds a little bit, juvenile, sounds a little bit small, but it's amazing. Businesses will go years and business owners will never look at their expenses on a granular level. So I love to go and just pull a transaction list and look at every single transaction and start asking questions. And often when you do that, you can find a number of things to cut. And then you do it again 3 months or 6 months down the road, and you can find more things to cut. It's amazing how many small things just get sprinkled into a business as you have different people, as you have different objectives, things that get sprinkled in that get forgotten about or just get overlooked over a period of time.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely see that, the farther I get along in my business, the more that I see that like you're just in the grind, right? You're just trying to run your business, do the things, but working on the business or analyzing the numbers is something that you just don't end up doing, right? Like you have this long to-do list, it's always up there at the top. And then at some point it's been up to the top, you don't even see it anymore, right? It's just on there,
Yeah.
and you end up never sitting down. And so I think not only is having the expertise of somebody like you valuable, but also just like the forced accountability to whether that's monthly or quarterly, check in on how you're doing. Because for most business owners I work with, if I ask them, what was their profit last year and how does this year look differently, I can think in my head, I think I work with about 50 business owner households. I honestly can think of one or two that I think would have that number down. And the other ones, it's just kind of like, it's not that big of a deal. We're making good money. I don't really have to think about it. But when you don't spend the time thinking about it and analyzing things, it's really hard to understand how you're doing, where you're going, and if the decisions you're making are right.
Yeah. Well, I tell people all the time, I said, if you spend 1 hour, all it takes is 1 hour per month looking at your numbers, you're going to be in the 80th to 90th percentile of all business owners. Because most people, what they're doing is they're looking at their bank account, they're getting panicked because it's lower than they thought, and they're making a bunch of rash decisions. And they don't ever step back and take that, okay, I'm going to look at my financial statement. And I'm going to look at this strategically for 1 straight hour. And so that's the beauty of the engagements is we force that because again, we're meeting with them at least an hour a month to talk through that specific financial result. And that practice alone for a lot of people is game changing because they end up making changes in their business because it's the first time that they've had that conversation. And that's what I think the beautiful thing of the fractional CFO is we're bringing that outside perspective and we can ask questions or have conversations that a lot of people inside the business can't have with them. And then that in and of itself, a lot of time results in change because again, it's the first time that they've really had a chance to sit down and do that.
So I think we would all agree that, whether it's personal finance or it's the finances inside your business, it's really helpful to have a second set of eyes on it. But I think we'd also all agree that at some point it maybe doesn't quite make sense. You're not far enough along, or you can't really hire the person that you want to hire, or you're so far along that in your scenario, Curtis, maybe they hire a full-time CFO to come in. At what stage do you think is the perfect time for a business owner to potentially engage with a firm like yours on the fractional CFO basis?
Yeah, that's a good question. From my perspective, I typically say I'm in businesses between 2 and 30 million, though I have a business that's a little bit below that. I have a business that's almost 50 million now. So that's kind of a loose range. I think what a better kind of judge of that is what is the complexity of your business? So there's kind of two factors to that. Is how comfortable do you feel? Because if you don't feel comfortable, then it might make sense to bring someone in. But the other side is if you start having a lot of different vendors, if you start having people, more than one person in your business touching the numbers, you may just not have the expertise to be able to review that and understand that. So I like to say it's a complexity thing and it's a comfort thing. And if you can feel good about comfortable about the level that you're at, then you probably don't need it. But if you start feeling anxiety, like there's nothing, every fractional CFO that I know gets on calls with people before they need it and they'll tell them they don't need it and they'll give them some guides as far as what they need, or say maybe even some changes to make. But the reality is if you've got 100 to 200 transactions in your business, you're probably not per month, you're probably not big enough to need a fractional CFO. But once you start feeling that complexity with, terms, as far as like when you get money, you're wondering where your cash flow is. That's where the fractional CFO really becomes super valuable because you can now plan that cash flow, forecast out into the future, and get a really good sense of what decisions you can make now.
So one thing I have regarding cash flow specifically is one of the biggest issues that I see business owners do is either they don't have enough money in their business or they have far too much money in their business. And
Yeah.
ultimately the root of the problem is they have no plan around the money. It's like we either had a great quarter and we just have a bunch of money sitting in there and I have no idea what we're going to do with it, or we had a subpar quarter and I'm thinking I shouldn't have taken as much money out last quarter as I did. Do you help strategize around the actual cash inside the business? And if you do, I'm curious, how does that lead to conversations potentially in their personal financial life as well?
Yeah, 100%. So one of the things, and this is part of one of the first exercises with cash flow, is I like to have a discussion of how much cash do we want to keep in the business. There's a couple different factors when you think about that. As you think about what's the capital expenditure in the business, like how much money are they having to reinvest? Say if they've got heavy equipment, they've got to keep more cash potentially because they may have to replace or repair that heavy equipment before they expect. Another factor of that is what is the seasonality of the business? If they're a really seasonal business, you have to keep more money on hand to be prepared for those lean times, for those low times. And then the third is what is your overhead? So you can cut this a number of different ways. What I like to say is I like to kind of break it down to what is your payroll, and then what is your kind of the piece that you can't cut, meaning like what's your rent, what's your utilities, what's that sort of stuff, right? And so if you can get to that minimum, I like to say, how long would you feel comfortable having to paying your employees hoping to recover. Meaning, if you had everything cut off, if you had no money coming in, what would that look like? And generally that comes out to a couple months, right? Because you want to make enough room so that you don't have to make drastic decisions in the heat of the moment, but that you can also give yourself a chance to react and potentially improve the situation. So you take all those into account. That kind of creates a range of what you look like. And then it's a personal decision where you go from that point. And that ultimately goes to the personal, because the reality is some people are going to be really risk averse and they want to keep the max, and other people are going to want to keep on the low end of that. Once you've set that guideline, my rule is not that you're forced to take money out of the business, but it's encouraged that you take anything over that out of the business, because ultimately it's a returns game. Where can you get the best return on your money? And so if you're over that, you've already said you don't have any more that you can invest into the business and get a high return. So your best chance for return is outside the business. So like to compare them side by side. Here's your return inside the business. Here's your return outside. Each option you have, you then now have to take that excess cash and determine which direction are you going to redeploy it in. And so that is where it crosses over into personal. And I'm never going to tell someone you've got to keep this in the business, because my job, even though I'm working for that business, is to make sure you're personally getting the best return you can. And if you've determined you can't deploy it in the business for a better return, then absolutely remove that excess and take it to whatever vehicle that you can get a better return on. And just, I'll be done here, but that better return can be your wife hasn't gone on a vacation in 5 years, and your wife, like, it doesn't always have to be just about, one's 10%, one's 15%. You got to go with 15%. If this is what's best for your family, then that's pulling it out and using it for that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good framework. And honestly, where I end up going, most of my business owners, we talk about this level, and we end up falling somewhere between 1 to 3 months of like operational expenses, depending on who you are. I have some clients, right? Seasonality, they make 80% of their revenue in Q4, right? So they're going to stash a little bit more as the seasonality starts to flatline. But I think that like opportunity cost that you're talking about is really important. Do you leave it here? Do you take it out? And I find a lot of business owners, for one, don't have any yield on their cash, right? So the opportunity is actually like you have dollars in here that aren't really doing anything. But I also think you need to think about the type of business that you have. So like I look at myself, there's no dollars that should be invested back into my business. Really, I have team members that I'm hired. I pay myself everything after expenses, and I don't really keep a lot of cash because I would say our revenue is 5x our monthly expenses. And so if our revenue is down, all that means is I would get paid slightly less, which wouldn't really be a big deal. But then there's other business owners I work with where they have like a fixed return of like, if you put in $1 into ad spend, they get about 30 cents per dollar they put in. When you have that level of data on millions of dollars of ad spend, it's really hard to invest elsewhere because you're never going to beat that return. I think you still need to, right? You don't want to keep every dollar in the business, because what happens when all of a sudden you spend all this money on ads and inventory, and then all of a sudden your product isn't what people want. But I think when you have that level of data, which you're probably not going to get unless you work with somebody like yourself, then it just becomes way easier to make those kind of decisions when here's what I get by doing X. The alternative is I invest in the public markets or I hold cash in a high yield savings account. Okay, well, I'm informed that this is the right decision, versus somebody else who doesn't really know. They just know, hey, we profit $500,000 a year. Things go great. We do a whole bunch of marketing. It all leads to something good. I don't really know where those dollars are best used.
Yeah, I think that's too often the case, in that something works, so people start doing it, but then they aren't paying close enough attention to realize when it stopped working, and now they end up spending money on this thing. And so that's the beauty, is if our goal is to try and speed up that information lag, which accounting can often fall on the opposite end of the spectrum, as people want to make sure things are perfect. But as a fractional, my job is to get you the information as quickly as make sure we have the information as quickly as we can, so that we can make the best strategic decision because we've got all the right information in front of us.
So we've talked a little bit about the types of businesses that you are helping, what stage that business looks like when they're coming to you, what are those key numbers. I'd love to transition the conversation a little bit more towards when somebody comes in and they actually hire your firm as an outsourced CFO or fractional CFO. What does that engagement typically look like? You had mentioned that you sounds like you guys meet at minimum once a month, but would love to just kind of take us through what that client experience looks like.
Yeah, so we kind of have two separate phases, and you guys may have something similar, but ours is probably a little bit more, a little bit longer, in that we have an onboarding phase, and then we have kind of the ongoing engagement. That onboarding phase is really walking through every area of the business that we're potentially going to touch, in doing what we call kind of a health assessment. So we, within the first 30 days, typically try and do this health assessment, and we set out what we're going to do over the first 3 to 6 months of that engagement. So that's looking at pricing, that's looking at margins, that's looking at your long-term plans, that's looking at your CapEx, all these different elements of the business. And we walk through those over a period of 3 to 6 months, depending on the size and scope. Once we get through that, our ongoing engagement is we're meeting 1 to 2 times a month generally. There can be engagements that we meet more. There can be quarterly engagements, but I like to stick with the monthly engagement because I feel like that's where we keep the right touch points with the client. And we're generally doing a few things. Is we're creating financial packets that look at all of your key metrics and really try and simplify and visualize your results for you. So we help look at those, translate those for you, talk, ask questions, really go deep on those. And then we look at, we provide cash flow and forecasting analysis. So those are kind of the three main deliverables. Within that, we do strategic planning, long-term planning for your business, that sort of thing. And all of that is generally done within that biweekly or monthly cadence of meetings. And then in between there, we touch base, record looms, have asynchronous communication. And the way I like to kind of frame it, kind of, I guess the piece that I didn't include there was, if I'm coming on as your fractional CFO, I want you to feel like anything financial in your business, you can lean on me on. So that means you can call me, you can email me at any time, get everything you need. If you're speaking to your CPA, if you're speaking to this banker over here, we're going to be involved in those communications and that stuff as well. And so, for example, a client that I had just recently, they had a line of credit. I met with all their bankers along with them. I explained and walked them through that whole process. We were able to get them to a lot better facility than what they had before, because before they just kind of taken the first thing they saw that came to them. And so we kind of think we want to be a part of your team and we want to be that expert. I do want to reiterate, we don't want to do the work for you. That can be a bad thing, because then they put full trust. We want them to understand. And so we do view a piece of that as education as well. If you don't fully understand your own financials and you're offloading it to someone else completely, that's a great place to go to get taken advantage of or have bad things happen. And so we really view it as our job is to educate, and we want to offload. The way I like to say it, we want to offload the work, not the understanding. Meaning, we'll help you with some of the work, but you still need to understand it and you still need to be involved in this process.
That's a great line. I might have to steal that line.
Yeah. I like it. I like it a lot.
I mean, it makes a lot of sense. It's the same thing I tell my clients. It's like, we're never going to take action on something until you understand why. You don't have to understand all the ins and outs, the background, the rules, but you have to understand at least high level why you're doing what you're doing. Because eventually you keep doing things that they don't understand, and all of a sudden they're like, oh my gosh, I have this business, I have no idea what's going on, or why we're doing the things that we're doing. And then you feel even more overwhelmed. You're basically bringing on somebody who's going to do some of the work, right? Obviously you're going to do some of the analysis, but you're really bringing on like a person to sit here and be your education partner, your teacher, your guide, to help you make the right decisions. But just like, college or going to class, you still need to do the work to get up to speed on what's going on with their help. You're just not alone in it. I think that makes
and
a lot of
I'd
sense.
say, and I'd say that's where there's a ton of crossover between what I do and what you guys do. Is you guys can implement a strategy, but if they don't understand it, they're going to feel just as out of control as they did before. At some point, they're going to feel great at first, but then when they realize they don't understand it and returns are bad or whatever happens, they're going to feel just as out of control. And so the whole goal is to give them a peace of mind because they know an expert is there, a part of their team, and know that they can call that expert, but they still have to do the work to try and get educated on what they're doing. Because if they don't get that education, which again, I'm trying to help them get that education right, but if they don't get that education, then they're still going to be in the same spot as they were before they hired you.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, cool, man. Is there anything else that you feel like we need to hit on, as it relates to just kind of managing finances as a business owner?
Yeah, I mean, I think you guys would probably co-sign on this, but I think if there's one thing that I want to tell business owners more and more is like, do not ever feel ignorant or feel like you can't ask the question that you need to ask. It is your business. You ultimately need to take control of that. And if you don't understand it, the reality is the majority of business owners don't understand it just like you. So by being willing to ask the questions, being willing to get vulnerable, being willing to say, I don't know this, can you show me this? You're giving your business the best chance to succeed, which in turn gives you personally the best chance to succeed. So that's something that I cannot preach enough to these business owners, is never say, this is a dumb question. Always come to me and be willing to ask those questions, because, we have to hear things, whatever the stat is, like 7 or 8 times before we truly understand it. I know I'm going to be repeating things with you. And so the more questions you ask, the more chance that gets for you to really ingrain those principles, ingrain those things, and really give yourself the best chance for the best outcomes for you and your business.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's really important. I think the average person just thinks that they should know all these things, even on the personal life, let alone more how complex the business gets. But like we've talked about many times, this isn't something you've ever been taught, right? You're not the person who's like accountant, you took your step and now you've been working in finance for a business for 30 years. Most likely you're good at selling, or you're good at a service or something else. And now you also have to run the finances. Understand it's not expected for you to know. And everybody else that, working with you, working with us, our job is to help bring you up to speed, educate you. And you'd be surprised that everybody else knows just as little as you do. That's just kind of where we're at. But Kurtis, man, we really appreciate you coming on. Before we kind of wrap up, let everybody know best places to follow and engage with you. And if they're looking for an outsourced CFO, how do they get in contact with you?
Yeah, I mean, best place to have a conversation with me is probably going to be Twitter, right? I unfortunately probably on there too much, which I think you guys can probably agree with that. You guys probably feel the same way sometimes. DM me on Twitter. If you're interested in fractional CFO, bisoncfo.com is my business. So you can go there and check it out. But I'm 100% want to help people even before they get to that point. So never hesitate to ask questions in the DMs, and I want to hold you to that, hopefully. So.
All right. Perfect. Well, man, we really appreciate the time, and everybody, thank you for listening. If you have any topic ideas or things you want us to talk about, feel free to message either Jacob or I. But if you're listening and you're enjoying the podcast, please go rate and subscribe. We would really appreciate that. And we will see you back next week.